and so many people that are interested in this really, really important topic. We've got three great speakers today. The first one is Laura Schwartz, who is a historian of feminism and labour movements at the University of Warwick. Laura will be followed by Orthalia, who is joining us from XR South Africa. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Orthalia especially has to say about the experience of women in South Africa. And we're also being joined by Silvia, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Milan and an organiser of a campaign to make revenge porn illegal in Italy. So we've got three really different and interesting speakers to hear from this evening. They're each going to speak for 10 minutes, and at the end of that, we will take questions. So I think with no further ado, I will hand over to Laura if her technology is working well at the moment.
Yeah, if my technology is working well and if my cat leaves me alone. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to see if I can put it on gallery view so I can see people. Thanks very much for inviting me today, and it's really nice to be here. As Crete mentioned, I'm a historian. I recently wrote a book about feminism, domestic servants and domestic labour in 19th and 20th century Britain. And so in the firm belief that the study of history ought to help us create a better world in the present, I'm going to talk today about whether the fight against climate change will mean more housework for women. So in the face of extreme, terrifying and life-threatening climate catastrophe, chatting about housework will no doubt seem extremely trivial. But although, of course, there are many, many other issues that we need to discuss if we're going to if we're going to be serious about integrating a feminist perspective into climate activism, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers. So obviously there's lots of issues that pertain to feminism and climate activism, but I do think that the question of domestic labour, who does it, how it gets done, is an important one. And it's one that relates to much bigger questions about the relationship between climate change and inequalities of gender, race and class. Many years ago, I worked as a cleaner for an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. P. Mrs. P had been a home economics teacher in the 1940s and 50s, and key to her extensive housekeeping expertise was the principle of thrift. Accordingly, I was required to wash rather than throw away used tinfoil, scrub, not peel potatoes so as not to waste too much, and save the dirty washing up water to throw on the flower beds. These are all practices that I've actually recently taken up myself as part of trying to achieve a more sustainable lifestyle. But I absolutely hated doing them when I did them for Mrs. P. The kindly, authoritarian and puritanical ways of Mr. and Mrs. P, he was a retired vicar, were very much part of a certain kind of British culture, stretching back to the early 19th century, of waste not, want not, godly efficiency. I much preferred the attitude of my North American Jewish grandmother, a strong advocate of the dishwasher and, even better, paper plates and plastic cutlery, which she credited as the secret to her wild parties and generally enthusiastic outlook on life. So today I can see that my Bubby's approach embodied the rise of consumer capitalism and throwaway culture in the West, with its hugely destructive environmental impact, while Mrs. P's approach represented kind of the tail end of a reduce, reuse and recycle mentality that had once been widespread common sense and indeed needs to become so again. But there's nevertheless a lot of politics bound up in this proposed shift in our household practices. And these are politics that I do think it's important that we give them further consideration. Until the Second World War, Middle-class housewives in Britain and in most of Northern Europe and North America could rely on live-in servants to wash their tinfoil for them. And many of them, like Mr. and Mrs. P, who had been missionaries in Kenya, many of them spent years living in the British Empire, where they were able to benefit from the labour of a large number of low-paid domestic staff right up until decolonisation in the 1950s and 60s. Had Mr. and Mrs. P not been able to afford a twice-weekly cleaner, as they became older and more frail, they might well also have ended up embracing a more profligate lifestyle. Working class women of Mrs. P's generation, on the other hand, were horribly burdened by domestic labour, working 16 hours a day, cooking food from scratch, washing clothes by hand, and scrubbing out pans with lemon juice and soda. And so it's an uncomfortable truth that the introduction in the global north of fridges, washing machines, and hoovers from the 1950s onwards made women's lives much easier, whilst also using up fossil fuels and creating landfill. So, as of course, the reason everybody is here today is because, of course, environmentalism is absolutely an issue for feminists, for anti-capitalist feminists who want to challenge intersecting oppressions. So I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you here, but of course, those worst affected by climate change are women, who are usually the primary caregivers and people responsible for growing and cooking food. The people worst affected are also poor people, lacking the resources and infrastructure to deal with flooding and droughts, and also people living in the global south, where so far weather conditions have been at their most extreme and who are often forced to migrate and thus endure the dehumanizing immigration controls imposed in the cooler areas of the planet. It's the wealthy, not the working class, who have the least environmentally sustainable lifestyles, consuming far more, flying frequently, and having bigger houses that use up more heating, etc. So the struggle against climate catastrophe, of course, requires a massive structural transformation of our economy, energy production, and industry. But it also necessitates a transformation of the way we live our everyday lives and the reorganization of our homes. And I suggest that we need to more seriously consider the politics of gender, race, and class that this will entail. Although the increasing popularity of eco-friendly household tips is no doubt a good thing, what is hardly ever mentioned is that this new environmentally sustainable approach to housework is also more labour intensive and more time consuming. Avoiding heavily packaged processed food, sponging and airing clothes rather than chucking them in the washing machine, using a manual carpet sweeper rather than a vacuum cleaner, toweling over disposable nappies, avoiding highly effective and highly toxic chemical cleaners, sterilising our moon cups rather than throwing tampons in landfill, and even washing up everything that goes in the recycling bin. All of this takes time and effort, and it is work that continues to be carried out by mainly women, whether for free by mothers and female partners, or for poverty wages by a cleaner who is also often a migrant. Opposing climate change in the home needs to challenge rather than entrench these inequalities of gender, race, and class, not least because if the only message for how to live a more sustainable life involves doing loads more work in a culture where there is already very little free time, then few people will be convinced to make the necessary changes. So I want to finish by just suggesting a few feminist demands around everyday sustainability, just some kind of ideas about what this might look like. Could we have, for example, more community kitchens providing affordable, non-processed food benefiting from economies of scale? Should we be sharing household technology with neighbours via easily accessible laundry rooms in every block of flats? Should we collectively purchase high quality industrial items that don't break after a couple of years? More opportunities for communal living in general, rather than inefficient nuclear family units that require us to do more cleaning and the endless replication of household commodities. Do we need a shorter working week to give us time to cook our own food or even grow our own food? Yes, please, I say to the last one. Okay, so I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation, and I'm very keen to hear what other people think about what I've just said, and whether you also have more suggestions for the kind of transformation that we need to be arguing for in our everyday domestic lives here in Britain. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura. There's lots of food for thought there, lots of things to think about. I'm sure people are already frantically scribbling down questions that they want to ask. I'd ask you all to keep a note of your questions and hold on to them until we've heard from all of our speakers. That would be really helpful. So we're going to turn now to Orthalia to tell us a little bit about how women are impacted by climate breakdown in South Africa. Orthalia, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, hi, everyone. My name is Orthalia Kunene. I think I should start off with a disclaimer. I am a feminist, an African feminist to be exact. African feminism acknowledges Africa's historical colonial realities, hence our battle is twofold. One is to dismantle patriarchal capitalism and neoliberalism. I'm also a writer and an XR grassroots activist in my community. I grew up in an environment that normalized the oppression of women. I only realized later in my life that I, like so many other women in my country, fell into the democratic that unfortunately suffers the most because of the reality is global capitalism has placed women, especially Black women, at the bottom of the system. Climate change is a direct product of the patriarchal capitalist economy model built on the destruction and exploitation of human and natural resources. The destruction and oppression of women through control of women's bodies, mind, and labor is part and parcel of this system. Today's topic does not only talk about the lived experiences of many women in the global South, but it also talks to me as a young Black woman who grew up in a small rural town called Vicksburg in South Africa. Growing up, child brides were a norm in my community. It was tradition for older men to marry young girls. And often the phrase women mature faster than men was used to justify the tradition. One tradition that still gives me sleepless nights till this day is called Hushubediswa. Hushubediswa is organized men would kidnap a young woman in any community and keep her in a secluded place, rape her until she falls pregnant, and then only later on contact their family for a marriage proposal. This is something that happened to my friend. A friend of mine was 12 years old when she was actually handed over for marriage from her family to a different family. And the reason behind this was the fact that the family owned a piece of land that later got destroyed. Their harvest, they lost their harvest, they lost everything due to the heavy floods that happened when I was still growing up. This is a normal reality for majority of young Black girls who live in the global South. A lot of young girls are really scared of either being exchanged for marriage or actually their lives being cut short due to issues that are related to climate change. I remember my friend telling me that she tried to negotiate with her parents, but their parents were actually trying so hard to actually keep her in line, to tell her that, you know what, this needs to happen because this also means that we have one less mouth to feed at the table. And as I mentioned before, that this is the lived reality for majority of young women in the global South. South Africa isn't the only place where minors are being sold off against their own right and their own will to help their families survive climate disasters. Even in Ethiopia and South Sudan, young girls are also being sold off for marriage to also save their families. I remember there's a couple of stories that I also got to find out in South Sudan where young girls as young as 12 years old were being sold off to marriage during extreme drought and are also being exchanged for cattle. This is simply a survival tactic. It's a survival strategy to get young women or young daughters to relieve the pressure on families and also to generate income. I think there's so many research that has been done that shows that there is a close link between gender-based violence and the exploitation of women and girls and the destruction of the natural resources or our natural environment. For instance, sexual abuse was found in the illegal fishing industry in the Southeast and Asia and the Eastern and Southern Africa, where fishermen would refuse to sell fish to women if they do not engage in sex. As the natural degradation and stress on the ecosystem increases, that in turn creates scarcity and stress on people. And also human trafficking rates in areas where the natural environment is under stress also increases. The UN just released the latest report on human trafficking around the world. It shows that while most African countries have now proper laws in place, some of these countries do not even use these laws, and no reports and investigations or prosecutions are done. One study also quoted from the United States that an estimated of 357 million girls who live in conflict areas would result, they will result in the risk of exploitation and human trafficking. This is African girls that I'm talking about. You know, there's so many things that are happening in Africa. Just to look at Central Africa, where about 90% of lake trout has disappeared. Indigenous groups are particularly at risk. As the lake shoreline descends, women have to walk further to collect water, putting them in more vulnerable positions. The International Panel on Climate Change found that gender inequalities are further exaggerated by climate-related hazards. With the dry season now becoming longer, women are now working harder to feed their families. This also means longer walks to collect water and wood. And this also increases their vulnerability to rape, their vulnerability to being exploited by either by gender-based violence or any crimes that are related to the exploitation of women. It's not just women in the rural areas that are affected. Globally, women are more likely to experience poverty and to have less socio-economic power than men. This makes it more difficult to recover from the disasters that affect infrastructure, jobs, and housing as climate change intensifies. We are living in times where rape is used as a weapon of war against young girls and women. Let's just look at what has been happening for years in the DRC, where women and girls were held as sexual slaves for about 18 months, often subjected to repeated rape by multiple men. Girls as young as 12 years old suffered physical injury and illness, including HIV and AIDS, because of rape, as well as loss of their livelihood and access to education. This is a clear indication on what would be soon our lived reality globally because of climate change. In conclusion, patriarchal capitalism has indeed brought us to climate change and climate cries, inequalities and injustices. The fight against climate change should therefore be an anti-capitalist fight and a feminist one for that matter. Thank you so much. Hopefully I didn't actually take a short time, or my speech was not too short.
It was incredible, Orthalia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, wow. Thank you very much. We're gonna move on to our third speaker of the evening now, and then we will come back to questions. Silvia, would you like to take the floor for us?
Yes, I am. Hi, everybody. I would like to start by thanking Greenwich XR Greenwich for having me today. I'm very excited about this conversation. And just so you know who I am, I'm an Italian sociologist. I work in the University of Milan. And I work basically on digital sociology. So let's say that today is quite new for me as a field, but I'm very happy to have the chance to participate in this kind of debate. Actually, today I will bring more my experience as an activist than as an academic, even though I would like to highlight that during my experience, I always try to tie the academic research with what I do on the activist level. So last year, I became the promoter of a law in Italy who wanted to criminalize the non-consensual dissemination of intimate images in Italy, also known as revenge porn, mainstreamly. So I started to work a lot on gender issues, especially gender violence. And today I would like to also tell you why climate change is relevant when we talk about gender violence. The former speaker have already highlighted very properly, so I hope I can add more to this conversation. Basically, I was doing some research regarding the problem of climate change and gender violence, and many works are highlighting how actually women are the first victims of climate change, especially in developing countries, but everywhere. In this sense, I was reading a lot of works by Chiara Soletti, who I think is also here now in the listening, and she's the coordinator of the Italian Climate Network. So we have also some Italian data here. Just so we can go more practically in the conversation, I would like to discuss, for example, probably the most visible consequence of climate change on women, which is the most recent crisis of coronavirus, and the fact that we had to spend time in lockdown and in quarantine. So that was the most visible effect on women, because that was when gender violence increased a lot. So just to give you some data in Italy, for example, domestic violence increased, and there were a 75% increase in requests to gender anti-violence gender centers that were anyways closed, because in Italy they were not considered as a basic service. So basically women were left alone during this time. And not only physical violence was growing, which is obvious when you are with an abusive man at home, but also digital violence, which is kind of my field. For example, hate speech increased. Revenge porn also increased, with the data of the revenge porn headline of the UK, for example. We've seen that revenge porn abuse increased 70%. So that's a lot. It means that basically any kind of violence against women increases when we are forced to stay home. And then there are also other consequences. For example, Laura was already talking about the consequences on domestic labor, but it's always important to remember that in this kind of sense, the consequences are also very bad on the workload of women, also women who work in care works, for example. And then finally, there are also bad consequences on what are sexual and reproductive rights, for example, because abortion was also restricted during this time in Italy, was problematic. I guess it's not just Italy, but in general, we had a conversation after that, because it was very hard for women to have the possibility to have an abortion safely. So we need to discuss also about this kind of human rights that should be considered as basic. So to do so, I would like to just bring to the conversation this idea and see whether we can discuss about the idea that maybe when we talk about sustainability, we should think about sustainability as an all-around concept. So we have to think of sustainability as a recognition of human and environmental rights, not like we are separate, let's say, but humans are part of the earth, and we need to recognize human rights as well as environmental rights. So see ourselves as part of something bigger, of a bigger picture somehow. In this sense, when we talk about sustainability, we have to talk about inequality. So if we don't face the fact that there are so many problems of inequality right now, economic, political, social problems, and that women are still the most hit in this sense, we cannot talk about sustainability, and inequality is now become unsustainable totally. So when we talk about climate policies, I think that we have to take a gender perspective there. We need to really insist on the idea that we have to talk about the women condition in the world when we want to face also problems of ecology and climate change. And also, I think that as it was already discussed before, we need to have a big intersectionality when we talk about this kind of stuff. So one way to do so, in my experience, from my experience, is trying to create and build strong networks of different people that work from an interdisciplinary field on the same topic, let's say, because in Italy with the campaign on revenge porn, that was the strength that we had, like sociologists, psychologists, activists, lawyers, politicians working together to find solutions. So I think that that should be key. And we have to face economic and political inequalities, also maintaining this very critical stance against neoliberalism and capitalist model, because if we accept capitalism and we become capital realists, as Mark Fisher said, it's going to be very difficult to find an efficient solution. And so I will leave the floor then to the conversation, but my idea is that I always try to strengthen the idea that we need to have a new gaze on this. So we need to exit the very individualistic gaze that sees saving the planet less important than saving your own freedom. So we need to rebuild new conversation, new discourses that instead of talking and stressing the problem of individual freedom, which is important, but we need also to retake the idea of collective care. And I like the concept of care because it's traditionally attached to women and to women work. So it's the very, we are socialized to care, but what if we were all socialized to care? Because care is basically a relational approach, is a paritarian approach. It means that when I take care of you, I'm also taking care of myself. So it helps us to see ourselves as community and as part, again, of a bigger picture. And maybe this will also help to build the networks of intersectional movements that might look different from a first sight, but then are actually sharing a lot, especially with this focus on inequalities and sustainability. I hope I didn't run out of time. Looking forward to hear the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia. Karen, if you would like to